The morning silence broke differently that day. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto had learned to read artillery the way a fisherman reads the sea. 5 years of war had taught him the rhythm of incoming shells, the distant crack of the gun, the rising whistle that gave you 3, maybe 4 seconds to decide whether to stay or run, the ranging shots that fell long or short, while American gunners corrected their aim. Every veteran knew these sounds. They were the grammar of survival. On the morning of January 9th, 1945, dug into a hillside position overlooking the Lingayen Gulf on Luzon, he heard something that should not have been possible. No warning whistle. No ranging shots walking toward his position. Just the earth erupting in simultaneous detonation, a wall of fire and concussion that arrived all at once, as if every gun firing at his position existed at exactly the same distance, pulling their lanyards at precisely the same instant. The air itself seemed to shatter. When his ears stopped ringing and he lifted his head from the mud where instinct had thrown him, Yamamoto found himself staring at craters that hadn't existed 3 seconds earlier, at positions that had simply ceased to be. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 3 men from his squad were gone, not wounded, simply gone, absorbed into the red earth as if they had never existed at all. The survivors looked at each other with expressions that contained not just fear, but confusion. Something fundamental about artillery had changed, and none of them could explain what they had just experienced. This was not how artillery worked. This was not how any of this was supposed to work. To understand what happened on that hillside requires understanding what every soldier in every army knew about artillery in 1945. The knowledge was universal, carved into doctrine by centuries of warfare with gunpowder. Artillery announced itself. It adjusted. It gave you time. The sequence was inevitable as sunrise. A battery of guns, positioned anywhere from 2 to 10 miles behind friendly lines, would receive a fire mission. The guns would load and elevate according to calculations made by officers studying maps and tables. Then would come the first shot, the ranging round. This shell would land somewhere near the target. Forward observers would watch where it hit, calculate the error, and radio corrections back to the gun line. The second shot would be closer, the third closer still. This process of adjustment, called bracketing, might take 6 or 7 rounds before the gunners found their range. Only then would they fire for effect, sending shell after shell into the target area until the mission was complete or ammunition ran low. This methodology wasn't a choice, it was necessity. Every gun position had its own unique geography, temperature, elevation, the precise age and wear of the barrel, even the direction and speed of wind aloft. These variables meant that theoretical firing solutions from maps and tables were always approximations. The ranging process corrected for reality. For defenders, this meant artillery was terrifying but predictable. The first shells gave warning. You learned to judge from the sound whether the round would fall short, long, or on target. You learned which positions to abandon during adjustment, where to shelter, when to run. Experienced soldiers could even estimate which direction the fire was coming from by listening to the shell's trajectory. These were survival skills taught to every private, practiced in every army. Japanese artillery doctrine in 1945 reflected these realities completely. Training manuals devoted entire chapters to recognizing ranging patterns, distinguishing between harassment, fire, and preparation for assault, using the adjustment phase to relocate alternate positions. Officers teaching these skills were not speculating. They were passing down knowledge verified by every artillery engagement in human history. Sergeant Yamamoto had learned these lessons in Manchuria, fighting Chinese forces whose Soviet advisors had taught them the same doctrines the Japanese themselves employed. He had survived artillery at Bataan and Corregidor, had weathered American bombardments at Buna and Leh. Each time, the pattern held. The first shells missed. Then they came closer. Then you were in the fight for your life, but at least you'd had those first few seconds to prepare, to take cover, to get your head down into whatever hole or fold in the earth might shield you from the storm. The Americans, everyone knew, had more guns than any army in history. They fired more shells in a single barrage than the Imperial Japanese Army might use in a month. But they were still artillery. They still had to range. They still had to adjust. The rules were the fine of a rules. Except somewhere in the doctrinal manuals and training schools and fire direction centers of the United States Army, someone had decided the rules could be rewritten. The concept that destroyed Sergeant Yamamoto's understanding of artillery that morning had a precise name in American doctrine: time on target. The phrase was technical, almost boring, the kind of terminology that appeared in field manuals and fire direction procedures without drama or emphasis. But what it represented was a mathematical revolution in how artillery killed. The idea was simple to state, but extraordinarily complex to execute. Multiple batteries of guns, positioned at different distances from a target, would fire at different times, calculating their shells' flight paths so that every projectile arrived at the target at exactly the same instant, not approximately the same moment, not within a few seconds. The exact same fraction of a second, as measured by synchronized watches and stopwatches, calibrated before each mission. To defenders, time on target eliminated the most basic assumption about artillery, that it arrived sequentially. There would be no ranging phase because there was no need to range. The first shells that landed would already have the range, and every shell fired would land simultaneously. The sound of impact would be the first and only warning. By the time you heard it, you were already inside the explosion. The technique demanded several things that, in 1945, only the United States Army possessed in abundance. It required multiple batteries positioned at surveyed locations with precisely known coordinates. It required reliable communications between these batteries and a central fire direction center. It required standardized ammunition with consistent propellant charges and projectile weights so that flight times could be calculated with precision. It required accurate maps. It required officers and non-commissioned officers trained in mathematics, sophisticated enough to work backward from a time of impact to calculate when each gun needed to fire. And it required the kind of systematic organizational discipline that ensured all these elements functioned together under combat conditions. The mathematics themselves were not particularly advanced. Any student of ballistics could understand the principle. If a shell takes 30 seconds to reach the target from battery A but 40 seconds from battery B, then battery B must fire 10 seconds before battery A. Extend that logic across 6 or 8 batteries at varying distances, add corrections for elevation and wind, synchronize your firing times, and in theory, you achieve simultaneous impact. Theory, however, was one thing. Reality was something else entirely. The American achievement was not in understanding the mathematics, but in building the infrastructure that made the mathematics matter. Consider what was required to execute a single time-on-target mission. First, survey teams had to establish precise locations for each gun position, using techniques that placed each battery's coordinates within meters of accuracy. This alone required trained personnel, specialized equipment, and time resources that most armies in 1945 simply could not spare under combat conditions. The Imperial Japanese Army, for instance, often positioned its guns based on visual estimates and terrain features rather than precise surveying, accepting that some inaccuracy was the price of mobility and speed. Second, communications had to link all participating batteries to a central fire direction center without interruption. The U.S. Army had radios, thousands of them, manufactured by the tens of thousands in factories back home, standardized so that any radio operator could work any set, maintained by trained technicians with access to replacement parts. Japanese artillery units often relied on field telephone lines vulnerable to shell fire or on runner systems that measured response time in minutes rather than seconds. The communications infrastructure that time on target demanded was itself a reflection of industrial capacity, most armies simply did not possess. Third, every gun firing in a time-on-target mission needed to be using ammunition with identical characteristics. This meant standardized propellant charges, projectiles of consistent weight, fuses set to identical specifications. American factories produced 155mm shells by the millions, each manufactured to tolerances that ensured predictable performance. Variations existed. Of course, no manufacturing process is perfect, but they existed within ranges that fire direction officers could account for, with minor adjustments to their calculations. Japanese artillery ammunition, by contrast, came from multiple sources with varying quality control, often using substitute materials as resource shortages intensified through the war. When propellant charges varied in power, when shell weights fluctuated due to manufacturing variations, the kind of precise flight time calculations time on target required became impossible. You might hit the target, but you would not hit it at a synchronized instant. Fourth, the technique required a level of training that extended far beyond gun crews. Fire direction officers needed to be comfortable with ballistic tables, coordinate geometry, and timing calculations. Forward observers needed to be able to call for missions with precise target coordinates rather than approximate descriptions. Communication personnel needed to relay complex fire mission data without error, often under fire themselves. The American Army had created schools for this, had developed standardized procedures documented in field manuals, distributed throughout the artillery branch. It had drilled these techniques until they became routine rather than exceptional. By early 1945, time on target had evolved from experimental technique to standard doctrine for American artillery units throughout the Pacific Theater. It was used not for special occasions, but as the default method for massed fires when multiple batteries could be coordinated. The technique had been refined in North Africa and Italy, perfected in France, and brought to the Pacific, where it was employed against Japanese positions with systematic regularity. From the perspective of American fire direction centers, time on target represented efficiency. Why waste ammunition on ranging shots when survey data and proper calculations could put the first salvo on target? Why give the enemy warning when surprise was available? Why allow defenders time to take cover when you could catch them in the open? The technique was logical, even obvious, once the infrastructure existed to support it. From the perspective of Japanese defenders, time on target represented something incomprehensible, a violation of natural law, artillery, that ignored the rules of physics themselves. And that morning on Luzon, as Sergeant Yamamoto pulled himself from the mud and tried to understand what had just happened to his position, the full implications were only beginning to register. The Americans, he realized, were not just firing more shells. They had changed how artillery itself worked. And if they could do that, what else had they changed? What other rules that every soldier knew to be immutable had the Americans simply decided to rewrite? The invasion of Luzon in January 1945 represented the largest American operation in the Pacific Theater to that date. General Douglas MacArthur's return to the Philippines involved more than 250,000 American troops, supported by an armada of over 800 vessels. The landing sites at Lingayen Gulf on the northwest coast of Luzon put American forces within 120 miles of Manila, positioned to drive south and reclaim the Philippine capital. Japanese defenders knew the invasion was coming. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding approximately 250,000 troops of the 14th Area Army, had spent months preparing defensive positions throughout Luzon. But Yamashita faced a fundamental problem. He could not defend everywhere with equal strength. American naval and air supremacy meant that MacArthur could choose his landing sites, could concentrate overwhelming force at any point he selected. Japanese forces had to be dispersed to cover multiple possible landing zones, then attempt to concentrate after American intentions became clear. The defensive strategy Yamashita adopted reflected these realities. Rather than attempting to defeat the Americans on the beaches, Japanese forces would conduct a fighting withdrawal into the mountainous interior of Luzon, where terrain would offset American advantages in armor, artillery, and air support. The goal was not victory by January 1945. Very few Japanese officers harbored illusions about ultimate victory, but rather to tie down American forces, to make them fight for every mile, to delay their advance toward Japan itself for as long as possible. This strategy meant that positions like the one Sergeant Yamamoto occupied were not intended to be held indefinitely. They were delay positions meant to slow the American advance, to force the deployment of artillery and the commitment of assault troops. To make the Americans pay in time and casualties for ground, the Japanese would eventually surrender anyway. The men in these positions knew they were expendable. What they did not know was how quickly and absolutely their presence could be erased. American artillery supporting the Luzon invasion represented the refinement of 3 years of combat experience in the Pacific. The army had learned painful lessons at Guadalcanal and New Guinea about the challenges of supporting infantry in jungle terrain with limited roads and difficult observation. By Luzon, these lessons had been absorbed and systematized. Forward observers accompanied every rifle company, connected by radio to battalion fire direction centers that could coordinate battalion-level fires or reach back to division artillery for massed time-on-target missions. Counter-battery radar identified Japanese gun positions within minutes of them firing, calling down devastating response before they could displace. Ammunition supply lines functioned with the regularity of peacetime logistics, ensuring that American guns never went silent for lack of shells. The artillery concentrations supporting 6th Army's advance from Lingayen Gulf included over 500 tubes, ranging from 75mm pack howitzers to 155mm guns. These weapons were organized in divisional artillery groups, coordinating with corps artillery and, when required, Army-level artillery assets. The fire direction network connecting them represented a synthesis of technology, training, and doctrine that had no equivalent in the Japanese Army. When Sergeant Yamamoto's position was struck by time-on-target fire that morning, it was not an accident or an isolated incident. It was the result of a systematic targeting process that had identified his position as a delay point requiring suppression before an American infantry advance. Forward observers had noted the position on their maps. Fire direction officers had assigned it a target number, calculated coordinates, and determined that a time-on-target mission involving 4 batteries would be appropriate. Radio transmissions had coordinated firing times. Gun crews had loaded and elevated their weapons according to data transmitted from the Fire Direction Center, and at the calculated instant, 16 guns had sent shells into the air on trajectories calculated to converge on Yamamoto's hilltop at precisely the same moment. From American perspective, this was routine. The Fire Direction Center might conduct 6 or 8 such missions in a day, supporting different sectors of the advance. Gun crews fired their assigned missions without necessarily knowing what they were shooting. At targets were grid coordinates and elevation data, not descriptions of enemy positions or assessments of why those positions mattered. The system functioned with the impersonality of a factory, turning intelligence about enemy locations into explosive weight on target with mechanical efficiency. From Yamamoto's perspective, crouched in what remained of his position, none of this systematic process was visible. What he saw was impossibility made manifest artillery that arrived without warning, that struck with precision on the first salvo, that came from multiple directions simultaneously. The explanation, when Japanese officers attempted to piece together what was happening, seemed almost more disturbing than the phenomenon itself. The Americans, they concluded, had somehow made artillery mathematics perfect. They had removed human error, had compensated for every variable, had achieved a level of coordination that suggested not just superior resources, but a qualitatively different approach to warfare itself. And this realization, repeated in variations across every Japanese defensive position during the Luzon campaign, carried implications that extended far beyond artillery doctrine. If the Americans could coordinate fire from multiple batteries across kilometers of frontage with split-second precision, what did that say about their communications, their training, their organizational culture? If they could expend ammunition on the scale necessary to make time on target the routine rather than the exception, what did that say about their industrial capacity, their logistics, of their fundamental ability to sustain modern warfare? These questions did not require speculation. The evidence arrived every morning in the form of barrages that killed without warning, in the form of supplies that never ran short, in the form of coordination that never failed. The Americans had not just scaled up their military capability, they had systematized it, had transformed warfare into a technical problem susceptible to engineering solutions, had applied industrial principles to the business of killing with such thoroughness that even experienced soldiers found themselves confronted with tactics that seemed to violate natural law. Yamamoto had 2 hours to reflect on these matters before the next time on target barrage arrived, catching his reduced squad as they attempted to evacuate their wounded to positions further back. This time he recognized the pattern, or rather, recognized the absence of pattern, the immediate shift from silence to detonation that characterized the American technique. He was moving before the first shells struck, running for a communications trench, and that instinct saved his life. But the speed of his reaction did not matter as much as he thought. Time on target did not just eliminate warning time, it eliminated the ability to use warning time effectively. When every shell in a barrage arrived at once, there was nowhere to run that you could reach in the instant between realization and impact. By nightfall on January 9th, Yamamoto's unit had been ordered to withdraw to secondary positions. Of his original squad of 12 men, 5 remained combat effective. They pulled back under cover of darkness, leaving their dead because there was no time to bury them and no capacity to carry them. As they moved through the darkness, they could hear American artillery firing throughout the night, not the sporadic harassment fire typical of previous campaigns, but systematic, methodical bombardment of suspected Japanese positions. The sound was constant, overlapping, a testament to ammunition supplies that seemed infinite. In the weeks that followed, Yamamoto would experience time on target, perhaps a dozen more times. Each occurrence reinforced the same lesson. Traditional artillery doctrine was obsolete. The survival skills that veterans relied upon no longer applied. The Americans had changed the fundamental terms of combat in ways that individual courage or tactical skill could not counter. His unit would continue to withdraw, continue to fight delay actions, continue to trade their lives for time, but none of them could shake the growing certainty that they were facing an enemy who had solved problems. The Imperial Japanese Army was still trying to understand. The mathematics of time on target were not complicated. Any artillery officer with proper training could grasp the principles in an afternoon. But grasping the principles and implementing them operationally required infrastructure that could not be improvised, resources that could not be fabricated from jungle materials and determination alone. The gap was not in understanding but in capability, and that gap, Yamamoto was beginning to realize, extended to every aspect of the war the Americans were fighting. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Japanese response to time on target was systematic, thorough, and ultimately futile. Intelligence officers interviewed survivors, attempting to piece together the pattern of American artillery employment. They collected shell fragments, analyzed crater patterns, measured the timing between barrages. What they discovered confirmed what soldiers like Yamamoto had experienced. The Americans had achieved a level of coordination that Japanese artillery doctrine did not account for and could not replicate. Reports from 14th Area Army Headquarters to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo described the American technique with precision. They noted the simultaneous impact, the absence of ranging fire, the involvement of multiple batteries firing from different positions. They calculated, based on crater analysis and captured documents, that American time-on-target missions typically involved 4 to 8 batteries, delivering between 32 and 64 shells on target in the opening salvo. They estimated casualty rates per mission at roughly 30 to 40% for troops in open or lightly fortified positions, compared to 10 to 15% for conventional artillery preparations that allowed warning time. These reports were not panicked or exaggerated. They were clinical assessments written by professional officers attempting to understand a tactical evolution and develop countermeasures. But the countermeasures section of these reports revealed the fundamental problem. There were no effective countermeasures available with existing resources. The obvious response to artillery that gave no warning was deeper fortification. If soldiers could not react to incoming fire, they needed to be in positions that could withstand fire without reaction time. But constructing fortifications proof against 155mm high-explosive shells required massive amounts of timber, concrete, and steel materials that Japanese supply lines could not provide in sufficient quantities. The concrete alone would need to be several feet thick, reinforced with steel bars, anchored into stable ground. Labor requirements for such positions were measured in weeks per fighting position, requiring engineering equipment largely absent from Japanese inventories. Even if materials and time were available, deep fortification created its own problems. Static positions could be identified and targeted systematically. The American artillery network included counter-battery radar, spotter aircraft, and forward observer networks that could locate Japanese positions with increasing accuracy. Digging in deeper simply made positions easier to find and destroy methodically. The alternative, maintaining mobility and avoiding fixed positions, negated defensive advantages and made coordinated defense impossible. Japanese artillery doctrine emphasized flexibility and rapid displacement. Gun crews were trained to fire their missions and immediately relocate before counter-battery fire could arrive. This worked against conventional artillery that required time to range and adjust. Against time on target, coordinated with counter-battery radar, mobility became less effective. American response times, measured in single-digit minutes, meant Japanese guns faced accurate return fire within moments of revealing their positions. And the weight of American counter-battery fire, entire battalions responding to single Japanese batteries, meant that even if crews survived the first salvo, subsequent missions would saturate the area where they were attempting to displace. Some Japanese units attempted to predict time-on-target missions by monitoring American radio traffic, hoping to detect the coordination between batteries that would signal an imminent barrage. This approach yielded limited results. American fire direction procedures used standardized radio formats and often employed simple code words for target designations. Intercepting these transmissions provided little actionable intelligence. Knowing that multiple American batteries were preparing a fire mission did not reveal where or when the shells would land, and the time between mission, coordination, and impact was measured in seconds or minutes, insufficient for effective response. The most sophisticated Japanese response involved attempting to calculate likely time on target aiming points and keeping those areas clear of personnel until after barrages had been delivered. This required terrain analysis, prediction of American tactical priorities, and constant vigilance about troop positioning. It also required radio communications to warn units when barrages seemed imminent, communications infrastructure that Japanese forces increasingly lacked as American air superiority made radio use dangerous and equipment losses mounted. In practice, these tactical adjustments had marginal impact. The fundamental problem remained. American artillery operated at a tempo and with a level of coordination that Japanese military infrastructure could not match or effectively counter. Every tactical response available to Japanese commanders required resources, communications, or time that they simply did not possess in sufficient quantities. To understand why time on target represented such an insurmountable advantage requires examining the American artillery system as an integrated whole rather than as individual components. The guns themselves, while excellent, were not uniquely superior to artillery pieces used by other armies. The 155mm howitzer M, one that formed the backbone of American divisional artillery, was reliable, accurate, and produced in massive quantities. Over 6,000 were manufactured during the war, but Japanese and German artillery of similar caliber could achieve comparable accuracy and range under ideal conditions. What made American artillery dominant was not the guns but the system surrounding them. Every element of that system reflected industrial and organizational capabilities that, by 1945, no other combatant could match. Start with ammunition production. American factories produced approximately 47 million rounds of 155mm ammunition during World War II. This staggering figure represented not just quantity but consistency. Shells, manufactured in different factories, in different months, by different workforces, maintained tolerances that allowed fire direction officers to use standardized ballistic tables with confidence. Propellant charges came in standardized increments, charge 1 through charge 7 each, calibrated to deliver predictable muzzle velocities. Fuses manufactured to specifications that ensured reliable function within narrow time tolerances. This standardization was itself a technological achievement. It required quality control systems across hundreds of factories, transportation networks that kept ammunition flowing from production to combat zones without degradation, and inventory management that ensured gun crews received the correct ammunition types for their missions. The U.S. Army fired approximately 27,000 rounds of 155mm ammunition per day during the peak of operations in Europe and the Pacific combined. Maintaining that firing rate without running short, without mixing incompatible lot numbers, without disrupting the complex logistics required to move millions of pounds of explosive across oceans and continents, represented organizational capability that was itself a weapon. Japanese ammunition production, by comparison, peaked at roughly 1/10 of American output across all calibers, and declined steadily after 1943 as resource shortages intensified. Quality control suffered as factories resorted to substitute materials and simplified production methods. By 1945, Japanese artillery units often had to adjust their fire tables based on the specific lot number of ammunition they were using, because variations between production runs exceeded standard tolerances. This alone made time-on-target style coordination impossible. You cannot calculate precise flight times if your shell's velocities vary unpredictably. Consider next the communications infrastructure. A single American infantry division in 1945 included over 400 radios of various types. These ranged from handheld SCR-536 handy-talkies used by forward observers to battalion-level SCR-284 and SCR-694 sets that could maintain communications over dozens of miles. The radios were backed by extensive field telephone networks, with division carrying enough wire to string hundreds of miles of telephone lines. This communications density meant that artillery could be called upon from any point on the battlefield within minutes. Forward observers with rifle companies could directly contact battalion fire direction centers. Battalion centers could coordinate with division artillery. Division artillery could reach back to corps artillery assets. The entire network functioned with redundancy if radio communications failed. Telephone lines provided backup. If both failed, runner systems were in place as final fallback. In practice, communications rarely failed completely. The system was designed to function under combat conditions, and by 1945, it consistently did. Japanese divisions had far fewer radios, and those they possessed were often of lower quality with shorter range. Most tactical communications relied on field telephone networks vulnerable to artillery fire. When telephone lines were cut, as they frequently were during American bombardments, units reverted to runner systems that measured response time in tens of minutes rather than seconds. The communications gap meant that even if Japanese artillery doctrine had included techniques similar to time on target, coordinating multiple batteries for simultaneous impact would have been operationally impractical. The third element of the American system was survey and mapping. Time on target required that every gun position know its own location with precision and have accurate coordinates for the target. American artillery units included dedicated survey sections equipped with theodolites, rangefinders, and survey stakes. These sections would establish control points tied to accurate maps, then survey each gun position relative to those control points. The process was methodical and time-consuming, but once completed, it allowed fire direction centers to calculate firing data with confidence that the guns were actually where the maps said they were. American mapping in the Pacific Theater began with pre-war maps where available, supplemented by aerial photography and systematic ground survey as territory was captured. By Luzon, American forces operated with maps at 1 to 50,000 scale for most areas, with 1 to 25,000 scale maps for critical zones. These maps included elevation contours, coordinate grids, and enough detail for artillery calculations. They were printed in quantities sufficient that every fire direction, center, and forward observer had current copies. Japanese mapping of their own territory was often less precise. Pre-war maps existed but were not always at scales useful for artillery work, and reproduction capacity was limited. Japanese survey teams existed, but were fewer in number and less well equipped than their American counterparts. The result was that Japanese artillery often worked from approximate position locations and target coordinates, accepting reduced accuracy as necessary. This was adequate for conventional artillery that would adjust fire based on observation. It was incompatible with time-on-target techniques that required precision before the first shot. The fourth element was training. American artillery officers and non-commissioned officers attended specialized schools that taught standardized procedures for fire direction, survey, communications, and forward observation. Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, graduated thousands of officers during the war, all trained to the same doctrine documented in the same field manuals. This standardization meant that artillery units from different divisions could coordinate seamlessly, that officers could transfer between units and immediately understand procedures, that the system functioned as a true system rather than as a collection of individual batteries operating independently. Forward observers received particularly intensive training. They needed to read maps, call for fire using correct radio procedures, adjust fire based on observation, and make rapid calculations of distance and direction under combat stress. They operated at the most exposed positions on the battlefield, often accompanying infantry patrols or positioned in observation posts vulnerable to enemy fire. Their training emphasized not just technical skills but judgment, knowing when to call for fire, what type of fire to request, how to balance accuracy against speed of delivery. Japanese artillery training, while thorough in traditional gunnery techniques, emphasized different skills. Japanese doctrine saw artillery as supporting direct fire from gun positions close to the front lines, with crews often engaging targets they could observe directly. This required less sophisticated fire direction procedures, but exposed gun crews to greater risk. When American counter-battery capability made close support positions suicidal, Japanese artillery had to operate from defilade positions. Using indirect fire techniques their training had emphasized less thoroughly. The fifth and perhaps most important element was the institutional culture that allowed the American artillery system to function as designed under combat stress. Military organizations face enormous pressure to deviate from procedure when lives are at stake. Officers are tempted to make decisions based on incomplete information rather than waiting for proper intelligence. Gun crews are tempted to fire immediately rather than taking time to calculate precise firing data. communications personnel are tempted to abbreviate messages to save time. These temptations are natural and, in some circumstances, appropriate. What the American artillery system achieved was a culture where procedure was followed not despite stress, but because stress made procedure more important. Fire direction officers who received incomplete target data waited for clarification rather than guessing. Gun crews who could have fired faster took extra seconds to verify elevation and deflection settings. Forward observers who might have estimated coordinates instead consulted their maps and provided precise data. This discipline was possible because the system was designed to work, because training had been thorough enough that procedure became instinct, and because results consistently validated the approach. Time on target crystallized all these elements into a single tactical technique. It was not a weapon or a technology, but an expression of systematic capability across multiple domains: production, communications, survey, training, and organizational culture. Its effect on Japanese defenders was disproportionate to its direct lethality because it demonstrated, in a form visceral and undeniable, that the Americans had solved problems at a level of sophistication that Japanese forces could barely conceptualize. By late February 1945, Sergeant Yamamoto's unit had withdrawn into the Sierra Madre Mountains east of Manila. The city had fallen to American forces after weeks of brutal urban combat. Japanese troops in the mountains were cut off from resupply, living on reduced rations, their ammunition carefully rationed for defensive actions that everyone knew were delaying the inevitable rather than changing the outcome. American artillery still reached them. Fire missions came less frequently. Now the Americans were focused on reducing resistance in Manila and securing their lines of communication. But when artillery arrived, it arrived with the same instantaneous precision that Yamamoto had first experienced on Lingayen Gulf. The technique had not been a temporary surprise or a special tactic reserved for major operations. It was simply how American artillery functioned. It had become routine. In March, Yamamoto was wounded during a time-on-target barrage that caught his platoon while they were relocating to avoid an American patrol. The wound was not severe shrapnel in his left, shoulder and leg, but it was sufficient to render him non-effective for combat. He was evacuated to a field hospital deeper in the mountains, where doctors with limited supplies and no hope of evacuation did what they could to treat the steady stream of wounded arriving from defensive positions throughout the Sierra Madre. The hospital, such as it was, occupied caves that offered some protection from American air attack and artillery fire. Even there, far from front-line positions, the sound of American guns was nearly constant. Yamamoto could hear them firing at night, systematic and methodical, working through target lists with the regularity of factory machinery. The sound had a quality different from Japanese artillery, a deeper thump, more regular in tempo, never the frantic bursts of ammunition-constrained batteries attempting to maximize effect from limited shells. He spoke with other wounded men, compared experiences, tried to understand the full scope of what they were facing. Everyone had stories of American material abundance positions overrun, where American soldiers had discarded equipment rather than carrying it, supply dumps that seemed to contain unlimited ammunition and food, vehicles abandoned when they broke down rather than repaired because replacement was easier than maintenance. But the artillery made the deepest impression. Every wounded man had experienced time on target. Every survivor had learned that traditional artillery doctrine was obsolete. None of them could explain how the Americans had achieved what they achieved, only that the gap between Japanese capability and American capability was wider than anyone in Tokyo was willing to admit. Yamamoto survived the war. He was captured in August 1945, when the remnants of his unit surrendered following Japan's capitulation. During his months as a prisoner of war, he saw American logistics operations firsthand, the vast supply bases, the systematized processing of prisoners, the medical care provided even to former enemies. Everything was organized, everything was abundant, Everything functioned with the mechanical efficiency he had first encountered through artillery fire. In post-war interviews, Yamamoto spoke about time on target several times. He described it not primarily as a weapon, but as a revelation evidence of an enemy that approached warfare with fundamentally different assumptions about what was possible. The Japanese military had fought with courage and determination, he said, but courage and determination could not overcome systematic technological and organizational superiority. The Americans had not just outfought Japanese forces. They had operated at a level of sophistication that made traditional military virtues increasingly irrelevant. This was not bitterness in his account, but assessment. He had been a professional soldier. He understood that wars were won by many factors beyond battlefield courage. What struck him about the American artillery system, and particularly about time on target, was that it represented capability rather than capacity. The Americans had not simply built more guns and fired more shells. They had reorganized how artillery functioned, had created systems that transformed firepower from an art requiring individual skill into a science susceptible to systematic method. And once you had encountered that level of systematic approach, you understood that the war had been decided not on any particular battlefield, but in the foundries and factories and schools and doctrinal development centers where the American military had been constructed. Time on target remained in American artillery doctrine throughout the Cold War and into the 21st century. The technique was used in Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts wherever American artillery operated. Modern fire direction computers automated calculations that had once required manual computation, but the fundamental principle remained unchanged: multiple firing units coordinating to deliver simultaneous impact, eliminating warning time, maximizing shock effect. The technique's effectiveness was never primarily about lethality, though it was certainly lethal. Its power lay in psychological impact, in the elimination of the one advantage defenders had always possessed against artillery warning time. Traditional artillery allowed soldiers to develop survival skills, to learn the grammar of incoming fire, to believe that experience and alertness improved your odds. Time on target rendered experience irrelevant. The first barrage you experienced was identical to the 100th. There was nothing to learn, no skill to develop, no way to use the warning signs that had always existed before. For Japanese soldiers in 1945, this psychological dimension was perhaps more devastating than the physical casualties. They were professionals who had survived years of combat by learning their craft, by becoming expert at the skills their training emphasized. Time on target told them that expertise no longer mattered, that the rules had changed, that everything they knew about survival was obsolete. And if artillery could be revolutionized so completely, what else were the Americans capable of? What other assumptions about warfare were about to be overturned? These questions did not require speculation. The answers arrived daily in the form of technologies and tactics that Japanese forces encountered for the first time. Proximity fuses that made anti-aircraft fire devastatingly effective, radar-directed naval gunnery that hit targets on the first salvo, radio-controlled airstrikes that appeared within minutes of being called, as logistics systems that kept frontline units supplied regardless of terrain or distance. Each capability reinforced the same lesson. The Americans had systematized warfare in ways that made traditional approaches inadequate. The industrial capacity that supported time on target was visible in everything American forces did. A single army division in 1945 required approximately 600 tons of supplies per day to maintain combat operations. This included food, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, and the 1,000 other items necessary to keep 10,000 men and their equipment functioning in combat conditions. Multiply that by dozens of divisions operating simultaneously across multiple theaters, and the logistics challenge becomes almost incomprehensible. Yet American supply systems met that challenge day after day, month after month, for years. The shells fired in time-on-target missions represented a fraction of total ammunition expenditure, but they symbolized the entire system. Each shell was a product of American industrial capacity: iron ore mined in Minnesota, processed in Pennsylvania, shaped in factories across the Midwest, filled with explosives manufactured from petroleum and chemicals, equipped with fuses containing precision mechanical components, transported by ship across oceans and by truck across islands, stored in forward supply dumps organized by lot number and fuse type, issued to gun crews who fired it once and received resupply the next day. The shell that detonated on Sergeant Yamamoto's position was the end point of a supply chain that stretched across continents and involved hundreds of thousands of workers in dozens of industries. This was the context that Time on Target revealed to soldiers who had been told that American industrial power was exaggerated propaganda, that Japanese spirit would overcome material disadvantages, that the war could be sustained through determination and tactical excellence. The technique was not propaganda, it was not exaggeration. It was simply American artillery operating as designed, and its operation demonstrated that everything they had been told about American capability was, if anything, an understatement. The mathematical elegance of Time on Target concealed its deeper implications. On its face, the technique was merely an optimization, a way to deliver more shells on target in the opening seconds of a barrage. But optimization itself revealed systematic thinking, revealed an approach to warfare that treated combat as an engineering problem susceptible to methodical solution. This was what separated American military capability in 1945 from previous industrialized armies. Other nations had built large militaries. Other nations had produced weapons in massive quantities. What the United States achieved was the fusion of industrial capacity with systematic doctrine, creating military forces that functioned as integrated systems rather than as collections of armed men. Every element of American military power reflected this systematic approach. Infantry tactics were standardized across divisions, documented in field manuals that every unit possessed. Equipment was designed for maintainability and ease of use, with interchangeable parts and clear technical documentation. Supply systems used standardized containers and loading procedures that maximized efficiency at every stage from factory to foxhole. Training programs produced soldiers who understood not just their individual jobs, but how their jobs fit into larger organizational structures. Time on Target was possible because this systematic approach had been applied to artillery with particular thoroughness. But the approach was not limited to artillery. It was visible in air operations that coordinated hundreds of aircraft with precision timing, in amphibious assaults that landed tens of thousands of troops with their equipment on contested beaches, in logistics operations that maintained supply lines across oceans and continents, in communications networks that functioned reliably under combat conditions, and in maintenance systems that kept complex equipment operational far from factory support. For Japanese soldiers who survived the war, the memory of Time on Target often crystallized their understanding of why they had lost. Not because American soldiers were braver or more skilled. Courage and skill existed on both sides. Not because American weapons were individually superior. Japanese soldiers had faced superior weapons before and adapted. They had lost because the Americans had created a military system that functioned with industrial precision, that approached warfare as a technical problem susceptible to systematic solution, that possessed resources so abundant that optimization was more important than conservation. This understanding carried implications beyond military history. It suggested that modern warfare had evolved beyond the point where traditional military virtues, courage, discipline, tactical innovation could overcome systematic technological and organizational advantages. It suggested that industrial capacity was not just a supporting factor in war, but the determining factor, that the ability to produce and coordinate complex systems at scale was more decisive than any battlefield consideration. These were bitter lessons for soldiers who had been trained to believe in the primacy of spirit over material, who had been told that Japanese warrior tradition would overcome American industrial wealth. The lessons were also undeniable. Time on target arrived every morning in the form of simultaneous detonations that killed without warning, in the form of systematic destruction that never slowed for lack of ammunition, in the form of coordination that functioned flawlessly despite the chaos of combat. The evidence was overwhelming, visceral, and ultimately persuasive in a way that no amount of propaganda could counter. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.